Blood on the Prairie, The Last Stand of Nate Champion. A tale of courage, conviction, and the battle for Wyoming's soul. The wind howled across the Wyoming prairie like a banshee's wail, carrying with it the scent of sage and gunpowder. On that fateful April morning in 1892, as flames licked at the logs of the KC Ranch, Nate Champion penned his final words in a blood-stained diary: "Boys, I feel that I am about to die. They have been shooting at me all day. Goodbye." These weren't the desperate scribblings of a common outlaw, but the last testament of a man who dared to stand against an empire of cattle barons, a man whose death would forever alter the course of Western history. Nathan D. Champion wasn't born to be a martyr. Like many who ventured west in the latter half of the 19th century, he was drawn by the promise of open skies and opportunity. Born in 1857 in Round Rock, Texas, Nate cut his teeth on the cattle trails, learning the ways of the range from seasoned cowboys who'd seen the frontier in its raw glory. His father, a modest farmer, had instilled in him an unwavering sense of justice and a belief that a man's worth wasn't measured by the size of his herd, but by the strength of his character. By the time he arrived in Johnson County, Wyoming, in the mid-1880s, Champion had already earned a reputation as one of the finest cattlemen in the territory. Standing just shy of 6 feet, with shoulders broadened by years of hard labor and eyes that seemed to pierce through pretense, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who knew his trade. His hands, calloused and scarred from countless hours of roping and branding, told the story of a life lived in service to the land. But the Wyoming territory that Champion rode into was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The Great Cattle Barons, organized under the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, WSGA, had carved out their empires from the vast prairie. Men like Frank Canton, W.C. Irvine, and Frank Wolcott controlled not just the land and the cattle, but the very mechanisms of power itself. They were the self-proclaimed aristocracy of the range, and they viewed the influx of small ranchers, men like Champion, as nothing short of an invasion. The conflict that would eventually explode into the Johnson County War had its roots in the very soil of Wyoming. The devastating winter of 1886–87 had wreaked havoc on the cattle industry, with losses reaching up to 90% of some herds. As the big ranchers struggled to maintain their grip on power, they faced a new threat: small ranchers and homesteaders who were filing claims under the Homestead Act, fencing off the once open range, and building lives from the ground up. Champion, who had started his own modest spread, quickly emerged as a natural leader among these little men. He wasn't just a skilled rancher. He was a man who understood that the future of the West lay not in the preservation of aristocratic privilege, but in the democratic promise of opportunity for all who were willing to work for it. "A man's got as much right to a cow and a piece of land as any other," he was known to say, "long as he comes by it honest and works it fair." This philosophy put him directly at odds with the WSGA, which had begun to label any small rancher who dared to build a herd as a rustler, regardless of evidence. The tension between the two factions played out in 1,000 small ways before it erupted into violence. The WSGA, wielding their influence like a brand, pushed through laws that made it nearly impossible for small ranchers to register their own brands or participate in roundups. They controlled the territorial legislature, the courts, and most of the press. But what they couldn't control was the growing resentment among the settlers and small ranchers who saw their American dream being strangled by corporate greed. Champion's rise to prominence among the small ranchers wasn't just about his skills with cattle or his natural leadership abilities. It was his unflinching integrity that drew people to him. In an era when many men lived and died by their reputations, Champion's was sterling. Even his enemies, and he had many among the cattle barons, couldn't deny his honesty. The first direct confrontation between Champion and the WSGA came in the winter of 1891, when he and several other small ranchers were accused of rustling. The charges were transparently false, but that didn't matter to the cattle barons. They had already decided that the solution to their rustler problem was not to be found in the courts, but at the end of a gun. Frank Canton, the WSGA's enforcer and a former Johnson County sheriff, had been building a list of men to be eliminated. Champion's name was near the top. The fact that there was no evidence against him was irrelevant. He represented something far more dangerous than cattle theft. He represented hope for the small ranchers, and that made him a threat that had to be removed. The first attempt on Champion's life came in November 1891, when a group of hired guns tried to ambush him at his ranch. They underestimated their target. Champion, who had developed a sixth sense for danger during his years on the frontier, spotted the trap and turned the tables on his would-be assassins. The gunfight that followed became legend, with Champion single-handedly holding off multiple attackers and emerging unscathed. This failed attempt only served to elevate Champion's status among the small ranchers and settlers. Here was living proof that the cattle barons weren't invincible, that a man of principle could stand against their machinery of violence and emerge victorious. But Champion took no pleasure in his growing fame. He knew that the WSGA wouldn't stop with one failed attempt, and he was right. The winter of 1891–92 was a time of growing tension in Johnson County. The WSGA, frustrated by their inability to control the situation through legal means or intimidation, began to formulate a more dramatic solution. They would raise an army of hired guns, deputize them as a militia, and systematically eliminate their opponents under the guise of law enforcement. Champion, meanwhile, continued to build alliances among the small ranchers. He helped organize mutual defense arrangements and worked to document the WSGA's abuses. His diary, which survived the events that would follow, reveals a man who understood that he was living through historic times but remained focused on the day-to-day work of ranching and community building. As winter gave way to spring in 1892, the WSGA put their plan into action. They assembled a force of 50 men, including hired Texas gunmen, and outfitted them with new Winchester rifles, horses, and supplies. The invasion force, which would later become known as the Regulators, left Cheyenne by special train on April 5, 1892, with a list of 70 men marked for death. Champion was staying at the KC Ranch on April 8, 1892, when the Regulators struck. The ranch, owned by Nick Ray, was supposed to be a safe haven. Instead, it became the site of one of the most dramatic last stands in Western history. The battle began at dawn. Champion and Ray were awakened by gunfire as the Regulators surrounded the cabin. Ray was hit almost immediately, dying in Champion's arms. But rather than surrender, Champion transformed the simple log cabin into a fortress. For hours, he held off the entire invasion force, picking off attackers with careful shots while maintaining a detailed diary of the siege. His last diary entries, written under fire, reveal both his courage and his humanity. He documented the death of his friend, his own wounds, and even took time to make coffee between exchanges of gunfire. As the day wore on and the Regulators realized they couldn't take him by conventional means, they resorted to setting the cabin on fire. Even then, Champion didn't give up. He continued writing until the very end. Well, they have just got through shelling the house like hail. I heard them splitting wood. I guess they are going to fire the house tonight. I think I will make a break when night comes, if alive. Shooting again. It's not night yet. The house is all fired. Goodbye, boys, if I never see you again. When Champion finally emerged from the burning cabin, making a desperate break for freedom, he was cut down in a hail of bullets. But his death was far from meaningless. News of the siege and Champion's last stand spread rapidly throughout Wyoming and across the nation. The public was horrified by the WSGA's brutal tactics, and sympathy for the small ranchers' cause grew exponentially. The aftermath of Champion's death marked a turning point in the Johnson County War. The people of Buffalo and the surrounding areas rallied together, forming a posse of hundreds to pursue the Regulators. The invasion force, despite their superior weapons and planning, found themselves besieged at the TA Ranch, where they were only saved from certain death by the intervention of federal troops. The legacy of Nate Champion extends far beyond the events of 1892. His stand against overwhelming odds became a symbol of resistance against corporate power and a reminder that one person's courage could change the course of history. The Johnson County War marked the beginning of the end for the absolute power of the cattle barons, though the transition would take years to complete. Champion's diary, preserved despite the flames that consumed the KC Ranch, became both a historical document and a testament to human dignity in the face of overwhelming odds. His last words, written as bullets splintered the logs around him, reveal a man who remained true to his principles until the very end. the Wyoming landscape still bears the scars of that conflict. The Casey Ranch site, marked now by a simple monument, stands as a reminder of the price paid for progress. The wind still howls across the prairie, carrying with it the echoes of gunfire and the memory of a man who dared to stand against an empire. In the years following Champion's death, the story of the Johnson County War became part of Western mythology, retold in books, films, and around countless campfires. But unlike many Western legends, Champion's story needs no embellishment. The simple facts of his life and death, his unwavering integrity, his courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and his dedication to justice, are more compelling than any fiction. Today, more than a century after his death, Nate Champion's legacy continues to resonate. In an era of increasing corporate power and economic inequality, his stand against the cattle barons serves as a reminder that the struggle for justice and equality is never truly finished. His story teaches us that one person's courage, combined with unwavering principle, can spark movements that change the course of history. The wind still blows across the Wyoming prairie, through the sage and buffalo grass, past the abandoned ranches and modern developments. And in that wind, some say they can still hear the echoes of gunfire from that April morning in 1892, when one man's last stand became a rallying cry for justice that would echo through the ages. As we look back on the life of Nate Champion, Texas cowboy, Wyoming rancher, and reluctant hero, we see more than just a figure from Western history. We see a man who embodied the best qualities of the American character: independence, courage, and an unwavering commitment to justice. His story reminds us that the true measure of a life is not in its length, but in its impact on others and the principles for which it stood. The Johnson County War may have ended, but the spirit of Nate Champion lives on in every person who stands up against overwhelming odds for what they believe is right. In the end, that may be his greatest legacy, not just as a symbol of resistance against tyranny, but as an enduring reminder that one person's courage can change the world. In memory of Nate Champion, who died as he lived, fighting for justice on the high plains of Wyoming. April 8, 1892. Join the adventure with the Western Echoes, Cowboy Tales Unleashed. If you're loving our cowboy stories and captivating tales, don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button to stay updated on all our future posts. Saddle up and ride along with us.